The year was 1879. The place was Silver Butte, a town that felt less built and more surrendered to the landscape. It sat in a shallow valley between gray, unforgiving rock formations and a stretch of land so dry the ground was a constant puzzle of cracks. The wind never truly stopped here. It was a persistent traveler, carrying a fine, salty, alkaline dust that coated everything, a permanent grit on the tongue and a sting in the eyes. This was the frontier, where the line between survival and surrender was as thin as the water in a dry creek bed. Into this world stepped Nora Whitlow. At 22, she carried herself with a quiet determination that the wind could not erode. She arrived from St. Louis on a stagecoach that seemed to be held together by dust and prayer, bringing with her three things of value: a heavy trunk filled with books, a smaller, carefully wrapped case of medical instruments, and a letter tucked deep in her satchel. The letter, its paper worn soft along the creases, was a summons for a family debt, a constant, private weight that had pushed her west toward this stark opportunity. She found a room for rent above the blacksmith's shop. The rhythmic clang of the hammer on the anvil became the metronome of her days, a sound of purpose in a town that often felt suspended in waiting. Waiting for rain, waiting for news, waiting for the next cattle drive. Nora did not wait. She scrubbed the floor of her small room, arranged her few belongings, and then set about her work. The old stone church, abandoned by its last preacher, had a deep, shaded porch. It was there, with the permission of a town council that seemed both amused and indifferent, that she established her school. A chalkboard was propped against the stone wall, and a dozen rough-hewn benches were borrowed from the saloon, smelling faintly of whiskey and regret. She also tended to the town's minor ailments, a splinter in a blacksmith's hand, a fever in a rancher's child, a cut that needed cleaning and stitching. She was not a formal doctor, but her hands were steady, and her knowledge, gleaned from 2 years of nursing assistance back east, was practical and sound. The small payments she received for these services, a chicken here, a sack of flour there, helped her chip away at the life she was building and the debt she had left behind. From her window, she first saw the man they called Caleb Hart. He was a cowboy. That much was clear from his worn denims and the easy way he sat a horse. He was 28, though the sun had etched deeper lines of experience around his eyes. He moved with a silent economy, wasting no gestures, speaking little. He worked cattle drives when they came through, earning his keep by pushing beef along the very trails controlled by the town's most powerful man. Nora noticed a pale, jagged scar that circled his left wrist, a detail that the town's gossip had already woven into a dozen different tales, each one ending with the flash of a gun. The most popular version involved a fight in Abilene, a dead man, and Caleb's quiet departure. The rumor clung to him like the alkaline dust, isolating him. The law in Silver Butte was a loose garment, worn by Sheriff Pike. He was a man whose considerable bulk seemed to have settled permanently into a chair on the porch of his office. His loyalties were as clear as the water was not. They lay with Royce Maddox, the cattle baron who owned the land on which the Blue Well was sunk. The Blue Well was the town's only reliable source of water, and Maddox controlled it like a king. The few small homesteads that dotted the valley clustered near it, their survival tethered to its pump handle. Access to the trail and a bucket from the well came at a price, a so-called protection fee that Maddox's men collected with unwavering regularity. The well was life, but it was also a shackle, and every soul in Silver Butte felt its weight. The atmosphere of the town was one of plain-spoken reality. Conversations were short and to the point, stripped of flourish. Humor, when it appeared, was as dry as the dirt, a quiet acknowledgement of shared hardship. People said what was needed and no more. One sweltering afternoon, as Nora was dismissing the handful of children from her porch school, Caleb Hart walked toward the church. He was not alone. He guided a young boy, no older than 12, whose face was pale beneath a layer of grime and freckles. The boy cradled his right hand against his chest, his knuckles swollen and raw. Caleb stopped a few feet from the porch steps, his hat shadowing his face. He kept his distance, a habit that seemed as natural to him as breathing. He addressed the boy. "Not Nora. You see the lady, Tom? She will fix you up." The boy, Tom, looked at his hand and then at Nora, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and apprehension. Nora came down the steps, her voice gentle. "Let me see it." The boy hesitantly held out his hand. The skin was broken and bleeding from a rope burn, angry and inflamed. Nora knelt, her gaze professional and kind. "This looks sore. We can clean it. It will feel better soon." She led the boy to a bench and fetched her medical case. As she worked, washing the wound with carbolic soap and clean water she kept rationed in a barrel. Caleb stood by, watching. He did not speak. His presence was a silent, solid thing. He watched her hands, how they moved with a confidence that was both practiced and soothing. He watched how she spoke to the boy, her tone calm and reassuring, explaining each step. When she was done, the hand was neatly bandaged with a strip of clean linen. She gave the boy a small piece of horehound candy from a jar she kept for her students. "There," she said, "you keep it clean. Come back in 2 days, and I will look at it again. And try to wear gloves next time." The boy nodded, clutching the candy. "Thank you, ma'am." Nora looked up at Caleb then, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. His eyes were a startlingly clear gray, like a winter sky, and they held a deep stillness. He looked at her for a long moment, a neutral, assessing gaze that gave nothing away. Then he nodded once, a clipped, small motion. "Thanks, nurse," he said. The words were dry, flat, and held no warmth. He turned and walked away, the boy scrambling to keep up. Nora watched him go, the single phrase hanging in the hot, dusty air. It was not unkind, merely empty, a transaction completed. Yet, she had seen the way he stood guard over the boy. A silent protector. She had seen the flicker of something in his eyes as he watched her work, an observation so intense it was almost a physical touch. He was a man of contradictions, a man who kept the world at arm's length while quietly tending to its small wound. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the gray rocks in hues of orange and purple, Nora stood by her window, looking out over the town. The heat of the day was finally breaking, replaced by the creeping chill of the desert night. Below, the blacksmith's hammer fell silent. The sounds of the saloon grew louder, and in the center of the town square, a lone lantern cast a pale, lonely light on the iron pump of the blue well. It stood there like an altar to thirst, a monument to the power Royce Maddox held over them all. It was the heart of Silver Butte, she thought, and it was also its chain. The water it gave was just enough to keep people there, tethered to this place, to this life, but never enough to be free. The first sign of trouble arrived in the form of 2 men who moved as if they owned the ground they walked on. They were Royce Maddox's men, their presence in Silver Butte as common and as welcome as a dust devil. They stopped at the edge of Nora's porch school, their shadows falling long and dark over the children's slate boards. The taller one, a man with a sunburnt nose and cynical eyes, took off his hat in a gesture that was more mockery than respect. "Afternoon, Miss," he said, "Mr. Maddox sends his compliments. He is pleased to see commerce thriving in our town." Nora, who had been guiding a young girl's hand in forming the letter B, stood up slowly. "This is a school, not a business," she replied, her voice even. The man smiled, a slow stretching of his lips that did not reach his eyes. "Everything is a business, miss, and all businesses require a town license for the privilege of operation." He named a price that was 3 times what Nora could earn in a month of tending to the town's ills. Nora looked from his face to the hopeful, worried faces of her students. She thought of the letter in her satchel, the weight of the debt she carried. Paying was impossible, but she knew this was not about money. It was about control. It was Maddox reminding everyone who owned the town, who owned the water, who owned their futures. "I am afraid there has been a misunderstanding," she said, her tone polite but unyielding. "Education is not a privilege to be purchased. It is a necessity. I will not be paying for a license." The man's smile vanished. That would be a mistake. To ensure her position was perfectly clear, the next morning Nora nailed a freshly painted sign to a post on the porch. The letters, carefully formed in black paint, were stark and clear: "Free schooling for all children." It was a declaration, a line drawn in the alkaline dust. The response came not with words, but with an act of petty violence in the dead of night. Nora had a small, sturdy handcart she used for hauling supplies, its wheels a constant squeak of protest. She had left it near the general store, loaded with a new shipment of primers she had ordered and a precious box of laudanum and bandages. She found it the next morning, not where she had left it, but splintered and broken in a deep, muddy ditch at the edge of town. The sight of it made her stomach clench. Her books, her precious books, were scattered in the muck. Pages were torn, their printed words bleeding into illegible smears. The medicine box was smashed, the glass vials shattered, their contents seeping into the brackish mud. She knelt, a small cry of despair escaping her lips. A few of her students who had been on their way to school saw her and ran over. The sight of their teachers' distress, of their school books lying ruined, brought tears to their young eyes. Nora ignored the scrapes on her own hands as she began the hopeless task of salvaging what she could. She wiped a page with the hem of her skirt, but the alkaline mud had already begun to eat at the fragile paper. It was then that she saw him. Caleb Hart was riding in from the south, a silhouette against the rising sun. He reined in his horse, his gaze taking in the scene with that unnerving stillness she remembered. For a moment, she thought he would simply ride on, another silent observer of her misfortune, but he dismounted. He walked to the ditch, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He did not speak. He did not offer condolences or ask what had happened. He simply bent down and, with a grunt of effort that spoke of immense strength, heaved the broken cart back onto its wheels. The wood groaned, but it held. He then turned his attention to the books, one by one. He picked them up, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. He brushed the worst of the mud from each cover before placing it into the cart. When the last book was recovered, he looked at Nora. Her dress was stained, her face was smudged with dirt, and her knuckles were bleeding. Without a word, he took the handle of the cart and began pulling it toward the church. Nora and the children followed like a small, bewildered flock. He hauled the cart up the church steps and onto the porch. He did not linger. He did not wait for thanks. He simply touched the brim of his hat in a gesture so slight it was barely perceptible, mounted his horse, and rode away. His silence was more profound than any words could have been. It was the silence of a man who understood that in this place, actions were the only currency that truly mattered. The incident with the cart hardened something in Nora. Her quiet determination now had an edge of steel. A few days later, that edge was sharpened further. Mary Winters, the mother of two of her brightest pupils, came to the school after the children had been dismissed. Her face was etched with a familiar, weary anxiety. She asked for a poultice for her husband's chest, but Nora could see the cough was not her true ailment. "What is it?" Mary Nora asked gently, leading her to a bench. Mary's composure crumbled. "It is Mr. Maddox," she whispered, her hands twisting in the fabric of her apron. "We are 2 weeks behind on our water payment. He sent his man. He said we would have to sign the new agreement." She pulled a small, greasy ledger from her pocket and handed it to Nora. Nora opened it. What she saw made her blood run cold. It was a meticulous record of debt. Maddox was not simply charging for water. He was loaning against it. For every day a payment was late, a steep interest was added. When the debt grew too large, as it inevitably did, families were forced to sign over a portion of their land, their livestock, or, most cruelly, their permanent rights to draw from the blue well. They became tenants on their own homesteads, bound to Maddox by a chain of ink and paper. "It is a trap," Mary said, her voice choked with tears. "Once you sign, you can never get free." As Nora was absorbing the cold cruelty of the ledger, the whispers about Caleb Hart began to circulate anew. A traveling salesman, his tongue loosened by whiskey at the saloon, had brought a new version of the Abilene story. The man Caleb had supposedly shot. The story now went, was none other than Sheriff Pike's own younger brother. The tale spread through Silver Butte like a grass fire. It explained so much: the sheriff's open disdain for the quiet cowboy, Caleb's profound isolation. It transformed him from a man with a troubled past into a man with a dangerous enemy, right there in their midst. People who had once offered him a curt nod now looked away, unwilling to be associated with such a volatile feud. Nora saw it all: the broken cart, the predatory ledger, Caleb's deepening solitude. They were not separate things. They were all threads in the same suffocating net that Maddox had cast over the town. She realized she could not fight it alone. She needed an ally, someone who was not already caught in the web of debt and fear. She needed someone who knew how to survive in this harsh land, and who was already an outsider. She found Caleb the next day by the blacksmith's forge, replacing a worn shoe on his mare. The air was thick with the scent of hot metal and horse. He worked with a focused intensity, his movements precise and economical. He acknowledged her approach with a slight inclination of his head, but did not stop his work. "Mr. Hart," she began, her voice steady. He continued to file the horse's hoof, his back to her. "I would like to make you a proposition," she said. He stopped his filing and slowly straightened up, turning to face her. His gray eyes were unreadable. "I need help," she said plainly. "The children, they need more than just their letters. They need to know how to live here, how to handle a snake bite, how to find their way if they get lost. Skills that you have. I would like you to teach a class, once a week, for the older children, and any adults who wish to learn." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of suspicion and surprise. "And what do you offer in return?" "Miss, in return, I would ask that you use your wagon to bring water to the school. There is a spring a few miles east. It is not much, but it is clean. It would mean the children have water to drink without us having to pay Mr. Maddox for it." He considered her words for a long time, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the determination in her stance, the lack of fear in her eyes. It was a bold request, a partnership that would align him publicly with her and her defiance. It was trouble, and he had spent years avoiding trouble. Before he could answer, a shadow fell over them. Sheriff Pike stood there, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his presence an unsubtle threat. "Miss Whitlow," he said, his voice a low growl. "A word of advice. You are doing a good thing here with the children. Do not spoil it by getting tangled up with the wrong sort." Nora turned to face him, her chin held high. "Thank you for your concern, Sheriff. But in Silver Butte, it seems to me that the only things that are truly troublesome are a lack of clean water and the inability to read a contract. I am simply trying to remedy both." The sheriff's face darkened, but he said no more. He gave Caleb a long, hard look, then turned and walked away. The air was tense after he left. Caleb looked from the sheriff's retreating back to Nora's resolute face. He saw the risk she was taking. He saw the fight she was inviting. He thought of the ruined books in the mud, of the quiet dignity with which she had faced down the lawman. He finally gave a slow nod. "1 barrel a week," he said. "Class is on Friday." It was a small victory, but Nora knew it was not a solution. Hauling water was a temporary measure, a protest. They needed their own source, something permanent. In the town's small collection of records, she had found an old survey map. It showed a dry creek bed, a wash that snaked down from the foothills. She spent an evening talking to an old prospector, a man whose memories were as tangled as his beard, but who remembered seeing water seep from the rocks there, even in the driest of seasons. A plan began to form in her mind, audacious and full of hope. If they could dig a deep channel, line it with wood, They could create a flume. It might capture enough of the underground seepage, enough of the runoff from the rare desert downpours, to provide a steady, if small, supply of water. It would be their water, free and clear. She wrote out a notice on a clean sheet of paper, her hand firm. She announced a community meeting to be held on the church porch to discuss a proposal for a public water channel. She nailed it to the church door for all to see. It was more than a notice. It was a challenge. It was a direct assault on the foundation of Royce Maddox's power. The town buzzed with the news. It was a reckless, foolish idea to some. It was a spark of impossible hope to others. That evening, Caleb Hart found her standing on the porch, looking up toward the dark line of the foothills where the channel would have to begin. He had heard the talk. He had seen the notice. This was a bigger fight than hauling a barrel of water. This was a war, and she was asking the town to enlist. He had built his life on the principle of staying quiet, of remaining unseen. This would make him visible. This would make him a target. He stood beside her in the growing darkness, the silence stretching between them. He thought of the Winters family and their ledger of debt. He thought of the boy with the rope-burned hand. He thought of this woman who had come from nowhere with a trunk full of books and a spine made of iron. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and certain in the quiet air. "I will haul the wood. You draw the line." Work on the water channel began under the cover of darkness. The first night, the crew was small, a collection of shadows moving against the starlight. There was Nora, holding a lantern, its light carefully shielded. There was Caleb, his broad shoulders making the work of lifting rock and timber seem effortless. Samuel, the blacksmith, a man whose arms were thick with muscle from a lifetime at the forge, swung a pickaxe with a steady, rhythmic grace. Reverend Michael, the old pastor whose church porch had become their school, was there too, his back bent but his spirit unyielding, clearing loose stones with his bare hands. The Winters family came, and 2 other homesteaders, men and women who had looked at Maddox's ledger and decided that the risk of fighting back was less terrifying than the certainty of slow ruin. They spoke little, their communication a series of grunts, nods, and the shared language of labor. The only sounds were the scrape of shovels against hard earth, the thud of the pickaxe, and the heavy breathing of men and women working against time. They were digging a line in the sand, a thin trench of defiance that snaked its way from the dry wash in the foothills toward the town. Each night they returned, their numbers growing by 1 or 2 as quiet courage spread from one desperate household to another. They worked until their muscles screamed and the first hint of dawn threatened to expose them. And then they would melt back to their homes, leaving the raw, unfinished scar on the land as the only evidence of their rebellion. Royce Maddox was not a man to be trifled with. He did not send his thugs to break up the nightly work. His methods were more insidious. He used the law. A week after the digging began, a notice appeared, nailed to the door of the sheriff's office. It was an official-looking document, full of dense legal language, but its meaning was brutally simple. It declared the dry wash and all subterranean water sources to be under the purview of Maddox's existing land and mineral rights. A long paragraph cited an obscure territorial statute. The final sentence was a clear threat any individual who drew water from or participated in the construction of an unauthorized channel would be subject to a lawsuit for damages and theft of property. At the bottom was the florid signature of Royce Maddox, and beside it, the official stamp of the Silver Butte Sheriff's Department. The notice had its intended effect. The crowd that gathered to read it was silent and grim. The legal language was intimidating. The sheriff's stamp a clear sign that the town's own law was aligned against them. That night, only half the workers showed up to the dig site. Fear was a more powerful deterrent than fists. Nora refused to be intimidated. That night, by the flickering light of an oil lamp, she sat down with a pen and a precious sheet of paper. She wrote a letter to the circuit judge in Prescott, the Honorable Silas Croft. She wrote with a clear, steady hand, detailing the exorbitant water fees, the predatory lending practices documented in Mary Winters's ledger, and the sheriff's complicity in Maddox's scheme. She described their efforts to create a public water source and the legal threats used to suppress them. She was not pleading for a miracle. She was presenting evidence. She folded the letter, sealed it with a drop of wax, and the next morning gave it to a young rider from the Pony Express, a boy she had taught to read. She paid him from her meager savings. "Do not stop for anyone," she told him, her eyes locking with his. "This letter must get through." The boy nodded, understanding the weight of his task, but they both knew the odds were long. The road to Prescott was 100 miles of hard country, and Maddox had men watching the trails. A letter could easily get lost. 2 days later, nature itself seemed to turn against them. The sky, which had been a relentless pale blue for weeks, turned a sickly yellow. The wind, usually a constant, sighing presence, began to howl, a rising, mournful shriek that whipped dust and grit into the air. A sandstorm was coming. Nora was in the middle of a lesson when the world outside the porch went dark. The wind hit the church with the force of a physical blow. Sand and dust forced their way through every crack, a suffocating, blinding wave. The children, terrified, began to cry. It was Caleb who took charge. He appeared on the porch as if from nowhere, a bandana already tied over his nose and mouth. He had a bucket of precious water. One by one, he dipped cloths into the bucket and handed them to the children. "Breathe through this," he commanded, his voice muffled but clear. He moved with a calm authority that cut through their panic. He herded them off the exposed porch and into the relative safety of the church's main hall, its thick stone walls offering some protection from the storm's fury. Nora followed, helping the smaller children, her own cloth pressed to her face, her eyes stinging. The storm raged for hours. When it finally subsided, the world was changed. A thick blanket of yellow sand covered everything, smoothing the sharp edges of the town into soft, alien dunes. Their half-finished water channel was completely buried. Worse, the section they had managed to line with wooden planks was cracked and split by the force of the wind and the shifting ground. It was a devastating setback. But the storm that had taken so much had also given something back. As Caleb and Nora surveyed the damage, their hearts heavy with defeat, Caleb stopped. He pointed to a place where the gale had scoured the earth down to the bedrock. There, in a place that had been solid, dry ground just a day before, was a dark, damp patch. A thin trickle of water, no thicker than a man's finger, seeped from a fissure in the rock. It was a new spring, a tiny artery of life exposed by the storm's violent surgery. "We changed the line," Caleb said, his voice rough with dust. It was a stroke of genius. The new spring was higher up the slope than their original starting point. It would give them a better angle, more pressure. Nora, her mind racing, took a long piece of baling twine from her satchel, using it as a makeshift measuring line. She and Caleb spent the rest of the day plotting a new course, a shorter, more direct path from the tiny, miraculous spring to the church. The setback had become an opportunity. Their renewed hope was a dangerous thing. Maddox's men had been watching that night as Caleb was hauling the last load of salvaged timber to the new site. 2 rifle shots echoed in the darkness. The first went wide, splintering the side of Caleb's wagon. The second found its mark. Caleb cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and stumbled. Nora heard the shots from the church. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced her. She grabbed her medical bag and ran toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found him leaning against his wagon, his hand pressed to his upper arm. Blood, dark in the moonlight, seeped between his fingers. "It is just a graze," he said through gritted teeth. She led him to the nearby livery stable, the air thick with the smell of hay and horses. She lit a lantern, her hands trembling so badly she could barely strike the match. But when the light flared, a strange calm settled over her. This was something she knew how to do. She tore his sleeve away. The bullet had gouged a deep, raw furrow through the muscle of his bicep. She cleaned the wound, her touch gentle but firm. She threaded a needle, and as she began to stitch the torn flesh back together, her hands were as steady as a surgeon's. He did not flinch, but she could feel the tension in him, the rigid control he exerted over his own pain. When she was done, she bandaged the arm tightly. "Thank you, nurse," he said, the words from their first meeting now imbued with a different meaning. She looked at him, at the scar on his other wrist, at the fresh wound she had just closed. For the first time, she allowed her hand to rest on his uninjured arm, a small, fleeting touch of comfort. The ambush meant to intimidate them had the opposite effect. News of the cowardly attack and of Caleb's injury while working on the water channel spread through the town. It was one thing to be bullied by legal notices, another entirely to be shot at in the dark. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place 2 days later. A dusty rider, a cattleman on his way to Texas, stopped at the saloon for a whiskey. He overheard the whispers about Caleb Hart and the death of Sheriff Pike's brother. The rider laughed. "Pike's brother," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet room. "That drunken fool, I was there. I saw the whole thing. The boy was waving his pistol around, bragging. He tripped over his own feet and the gun went off. Hart did not shoot him. He was the one who tried to take the gun away from him." The saloon keeper, a man who traded in gossip as much as liquor, made sure the story was repeated. It traveled from the saloon to the general store, from the general store to the blacksmith's shop, from there to every household in Silver Butte. The truth, finally aired, was like a fresh breeze clearing away a foul stench. Caleb Hart was not a killer. He was a man who had been unjustly maligned for years. The tide of public opinion, once a slow and fearful trickle, began to turn. The community, which had held its breath in fear, began to exhale in a quiet rush of defiance. The mothers of Nora's students began to act. They collected rainwater from their roofs in secret, adding it to the school's barrel. They brought loaves of bread, jars of preserves, and sacks of beans, leaving them on the church porch. It was a silent, powerful statement of support. During those days, Nora began a journal. On the cover of a simple, cloth-bound book, she wrote, "The days of little water." Each night, before she slept, she would write a single line, a record of their small struggles and smaller victories. Today, Samuel forged new brackets for the flume. Today, Mrs. Winters brought us cornmeal. Today, Caleb taught the children how to make a splint. It was an accounting of hope. One evening, she returned to her room above the forge to find a large wooden chest sitting by her door. It was beautifully made, the joints fitted with a craftsman's precision. The wood was weathered but strong, and she recognized it as the salvaged planks from her own broken handcart. She ran her hand over the smooth, sanded lid. In the center, a simple, elegant design had been carved into the wood, a single, flowing line, a river of hope. There was no note. There did not need to be. It was Caleb's answer to the books that had been destroyed, his promise that what was broken could be made whole again, and stronger than before. Royce Maddox's patience, thin as a sheet of ice on a winter puddle, finally shattered. He made his move not with guns, but with a chain and a padlock. One morning, the people of Silver Butte awoke to find the handle of the Blue Wells pump chained and locked to its spout. Nailed to the post beside it was a new sign. The price of water, it declared in stark black letters, had doubled. Below that, an ultimatum: the illegal water channel was to be dismantled and the unauthorized school on the church porch closed. Failure to comply would result in a permanent cessation of all water access. The town held its breath. The chain was a declaration of war. Thirst became a palpable presence, a tightening in the throat of every man, woman, and child. People looked at the chained pump, then at the half-finished flume, and then at the church, which had become the heart of their fragile rebellion. Maddox had linked all three, forcing them to choose between their children's minds and their own survival. That night, an unnatural stillness settled over Silver Butte. The wind died down, and the air grew heavy and close. Nora was in her room above the forge, mending a torn page from a primer by lamplight. She had been watching over 3 of the younger children whose parents were working late, trying to reinforce a weak section of the flume. The children were asleep on pallets in the main hall of the church, the safest place she could imagine. She first smelled it just after midnight, a scent that did not belong in the dry desert air, the sharp, acrid smell of burning pine. She went to her window and looked out. A malevolent orange glow pulsed against the dark stone walls of the church. Smoke, thick and black, billowed into the starless sky. A cry of pure terror escaped her lips. She did not remember running down the stairs or crossing the dusty street. She was only aware of the searing heat on her face and the sound of a low, hungry roar. Flames were licking up the dry wooden beams of the porch, the very place where her students learned their letters. Her first thought was of the children, but as she ran, she saw Caleb, already there, a specter emerging from the smoke, carrying 2 small, coughing forms in his arms. He passed them to Mary Winters, who had appeared beside him, her face a mask of horror. "One more," Caleb yelled, his voice raw, and plunged back into the inferno of the porch. Nora's mind reeled, but one image burned through her panic, the wooden chest Caleb had made for her. It was inside, just past the doorway, filled with her books, their only books. It was the future. She did not hesitate. She tore a piece of her skirt, dipped it in a horse trough she ran past, and tied it over her face. "Do not go in there," Mary screamed. But Nora was already on the steps, the heat blistering her skin. Inside, the smoke was a choking, blinding fog. The air was fire. She found the chest by touch, its solid form a comfort in the chaos. It was too heavy to lift. She began to drag it, her lungs burning, her vision swimming in black spots. The sound of splintering wood came from above. Suddenly, Caleb was beside her. He threw his heavy denim coat, soaked and dripping, over her head and shoulders. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice a low growl in her ear. He put his shoulder next to hers, and together they heaved the chest across the floor, through the doorway, and out into the night, just as a massive, flaming beam crashed down where they had been standing. They collapsed in the dirt, gulping the clean, cool air. The children were safe. The books were safe. But as they looked up, a collective gasp went through the crowd that had gathered, high in the belfry. The flames had reached the thick oak beam that held the town's iron bell. With a groan that seemed to come from the very soul of the church, the beam gave way. The bell, a symbol of their shared community, of weddings and funerals and Sunday mornings, fell. It did not ring. It struck the stone floor with a sickening, final crack, shattering into a dozen heavy, useless pieces. The fire and the broken bell broke the town's fear. By dawn, the church porch was a smoldering ruin, but the stone walls of the main hall had held. The anger of the townspeople was a quiet, dangerous thing. They gathered in the square, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on the chained pump handle. Caleb Hart stepped forward. He did not make a speech. He just looked at the crowd, then pointed toward the foothills. "There is work to do," he said. He led a procession of men, armed not with guns but with shovels and picks, out to the new spring. They were no longer working in secret. In the full light of day, they worked with a furious, focused energy, their anger channeled into the earth. They dug and they lifted, and by mid-morning, a small, muddy trickle of water, their water, began to flow down the newly completed channel, spilling into a series of barrels they had placed near the church. Nora, meanwhile, was engaged in her own battle. She walked through the ruins of the porch, her face smudged with soot. She carefully collected evidence, a half-burnt rag that smelled of kerosene, footprints near the back wall that did not belong to any of the townspeople. She wrote everything down in her journal, her words precise and damning. Arson, the deliberate destruction of a house of worship, the endangerment of children, the obstruction of education. She was building a case, not with emotion but with facts. Just as the sun reached its zenith, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. It was not a single rider, but a small group, moving with a purpose that silenced the work and drew every eye. At the head of the group rode a man in a black coat, his face stern and lined with the gravity of his office. Beside him rode the young Pony Express rider. The letter had gotten through. Judge Silas Croft had come to Silver Butte. He reined in his horse in the center of the square, his sharp eyes taking in the scene with a swift, comprehensive glance the smoldering church, the chained well, the new water channel, and the silent, waiting faces of the townspeople. Royce Maddox, alerted to the judge's arrival, came striding out of the saloon, a look of supreme confidence on his face. He held a piece of paper in his hand. "Judge Croft," he said, his voice smooth and welcoming. "An unexpected pleasure. I was just handling a small local matter of property rights." Judge Croft dismounted slowly. "I received a letter suggesting the matters here were somewhat larger than that," he said, his voice dry as dust. The town square became an impromptu courtroom. Maddox Sig, standing on the saloon porch as if it were a throne, presented his document, a vaguely worded deed that he claimed gave him exclusive rights to all water on his extensive landholdings. "It is all quite legal," he finished with a smug smile. "These people are thieves." Then it was Nora's turn. She did not stand on the porch. She stood on the ground, among the people. She did not speak of legal theory. She spoke of facts. She held up the ledger she had gotten from Mary Winters. "This is Mr. Maddox's idea of property rights. Judge," she said, her voice clear and strong. "He charges $1 for a barrel of water? If you are a day late, he adds 25 cents of interest. A week late, and your debt has doubled. He is not selling water. He is harvesting despair." She looked into the crowd, and her eyes found Mary Winters. "Mary, would you come forward?" Mary hesitated. Then, clutching the hand of her small, thin son, she walked to stand beside Nora. The boy was frail, his eyes too large for his pale face. "Tell the judge what happened," Nora said gently. "My boy took sick," Mary said, her voice trembling but clear. "We needed water to cool his fever. We did not have the money. Mr. Maddox's man said we could sign the paper, and the debt would be forgotten. We signed. We signed away our rights to the well. Now we pay him a share of our crop, for the right to live on our own land." Sheriff Pike, seeing the judge's face harden, decided to intervene. He stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "This is not a legal proceeding," he boomed. "This is a mob. I am ordering you all to disperse." He drew his gun, its barrel glinting in the harsh sunlight, and pointed it not at anyone in particular, but at the crowd itself, a general threat to them all. People flinched and fell back, but Caleb Hart did not move. He stepped forward, placing himself directly between the sheriff's gun and Nora. He was unarmed. He did not raise his hands. He simply stood there, a solid, immovable object. He looked Sheriff Pike directly in the eye. "Go ahead and shoot," Caleb said, his voice quiet, yet it carried across the entire square. "The bullet will only make the whole town's throat drier." The statement, so simple and so profoundly true, hung in the air. The gun in the sheriff's hand suddenly seemed absurd, a useless piece of metal against the fundamental truth of their thirst. Judge Croft's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Sheriff, put that weapon away before I have you arrested for contempt of my authority." The sheriff, his face flushing a deep red, reluctantly holstered his pistol. The judge turned his cold gaze on Maddox. "I am issuing a temporary injunction. This well will be opened immediately, pending a full investigation into these claims. The school, this water channel, and the church are to be considered protected property of this community. Any interference will be met with the full force of territorial law." Maddox's face was a mask of disbelief and rage. "This is my property," he snarled. "You have no right." He took a step toward the well, as if to defend it himself. One of the four-armed riders who had accompanied the judge unholstered his rifle and fired a single shot into the air. The crack of it was sharp and final. Maddox froze, his hand half raised. The fight was over. Judge Croft looked at Nora. "Miss Whitlow, if you would." Nora walked to the blue well. The chain and padlock seemed to mock her, but Samuel the blacksmith was already there with a heavy hammer, and with one sharp blow, he shattered the lock. Nora put her hands on the cold iron of the pump handle. For a moment, she just stood there, feeling the weight of it, the promise of it. Then, she began to pump. At first, there was only a dry, rattling cough, then a gurgle from deep within the earth, and then, with a rush and a splash, a stream of clear, cold water gushed from the spout. A sound went through the crowd, a collective sigh that turned into a cheer, then a roar of pure, unadulterated joy. People surged forward, not to drink, but just to see it, to touch it. Mary Winters held her son's hand under the flow, and he laughed, the sound as miraculous as the water itself. And all around the square, on the weathered, sunburnt faces of the people of Silver Butte, tears began to fall, as plentiful and as precious as the water from the well. The victory at the well was not loud for long. The initial cheers gave way to a profound, shared quietude, the simple relief of quenching a long thirst. The water was free, and in that freedom, the town of Silver Butte began to breathe again. The day after Judge Croft's arrival was not a day of rest, but one of labor, a different kind of work born not of desperation but of creation. The community, acting as one body, turned its attention to the wounded heart of the town, the church. Men who had spent their lives competing for scarce resources now worked side by side, clearing the charred timbers of the ruined porch. Women who had jealously guarded their families' water rations now brought buckets from the blue well to mix mortar and wash the soot from the stone walls. The air, which for so long had tasted of dust and fear, now filled with the clean scents of fresh sawn lumber and wet earth. It was a baptism of sweat and purpose. Through it all, Caleb Hart was a silent, driving force. His bandaged arm was a stark reminder of the cost of their fight, but it did not slow him. He worked with a relentless energy, his silence more eloquent than any sermon. When the rubble was cleared and the new foundation laid, he did not join the carpenters. Instead, he turned his attention to the great, broken shards of the iron bell that lay on the church floor. With help from several other men, he loaded the heavy pieces onto his wagon and hauled them to the blacksmith's forge. And there, he stayed, all through the day and deep into the night. The forge, which had been a place of simple, practical work, became a crucible of resurrection. The whole town could hear the rhythmic roar of the bellows and the steady, resonant clang of hammer on metal. Nora stood at her window for a time, watching the shower of orange sparks fly up into the darkness. She saw the silhouette of his shoulders, the powerful swing of his arm. He was not just a blacksmith that night, he was an alchemist, taking the shattered symbol of their community and, through fire and force, preparing to make it whole again. He was hammering out their anger, their grief, and their hope into a new shape. While the town rebuilt its church, Judge Croft rebuilt its laws. He set up a makeshift courtroom in the main hall of the saloon, the irony of which was lost on no one. One by one, he called the homesteaders forward, with Nora standing beside them, giving quiet encouragement. They gave their testimony. Mary Winters presented the ledger, its pages a damning indictment of Maddox's greed. Others told stories of threats, of intimidation, of the slow, crushing weight of manufactured debt. The judge listened to each one, his face impassive, but his pen scratched ceaselessly across his notepad. When the last testimony was given, he took the pile of ledgers and contracts, bound them in oilcloth, and sealed the package with his official stamp. They were no longer instruments of oppression. They were evidence. His judgment on the town's lawman was swift and public. He met Sheriff Pike in the middle of the street. "Your service to this community appears to have been a service to one man. the judge declared, his voice carrying to the onlookers. "You are suspended from your duties, pending a full investigation by the territorial marshal. Hand over your badge." The sheriff, his face pale and slack, unpinned the tin star from his chest and handed it to the judge. He was no longer a figure of authority, just a large, defeated man who now stood on the wrong side of the law he was supposed to uphold. For Royce Maddox, the consequences were financial, the only language he truly understood. Judge Croft's ruling was clear. All water debts recorded in the seized ledgers were declared null and void. Furthermore, Maddox was ordered to repay every dollar he had collected in protection fees and inflated water charges over the last 2 years. A significant portion of the repaid funds, the judge decreed, would not be returned to individuals, but would instead be placed into a town trust. From this trust, a community water council would be formed, its members elected by the townspeople, to manage and maintain both the well and the new flume as a public utility for the benefit of all. Maddox's monopoly was not just broken. It was dismantled and its parts handed back to the people. In the midst of this civic rebirth, Nora formalized her own role. She cleaned out a small, disused storeroom at the back of the church's main hall, with a fresh coat of whitewash and shelves built by the town's carpenter. It became a small but proper clinic. She hung a new, hand-painted sign above the door. The letters clear and proud: Health, Learning, Water. For all. It was more than a sign. It was the town's new constitution, as the community was settling its accounts. Caleb felt the need to settle his own. The cattleman who had cleared his name in the Abilene affair was still in town, held as a material witness by Judge Croft. One afternoon, Caleb sat down with the man, whose name was Elias Thorne, and a sheet of paper Nora had given him. For a man whose hands were so skilled with a hammer and reins, a pen was an awkward, foreign tool. He labored over the words, his brow furrowed in concentration. He wrote out the story of that night in Abilene, not the rumors, but the simple, tragic truth of a young man's foolishness. He described his attempt to disarm Pike's brother, the accidental discharge, the ensuing chaos. When he was finished, he signed his name at the bottom. The letters carefully, almost painfully, formed. Elias Thorne read it, nodded, and signed his own name below Caleb's. His signature a swift, confident scrawl that attested to the truth of the statement. Caleb gave the paper to Judge Croft, who read it and placed it into the official record. It was not an act of vengeance, but of quiet vindication. The weight of the lie he had carried for so long was finally lifted. The spring brought the first of the long cattle drives, a river of beef flowing north. In years past, the trail bosses would have had to negotiate with Maddox, paying his exorbitant fees for the right to water their thirsty herds at the Blue Well. This year was different. The new water council met the trail boss, and they offered him full access not just to the well, but to the flume, for a fair and honest price. The cattle drank their fill, and the money they paid went directly into the town's trust, to be used for school supplies and for the upkeep of the new water system. The cycle of extortion had been replaced by a cycle of honest commerce. In the quiet evenings, after the work was done, a new routine formed. Nora would often find Caleb sitting on the top step of the newly built church porch, his back against a post, watching the last light fade from the sky. She would bring a cup of chicory coffee for him and one for herself, and she would sit on the step below. They did not always talk. Often, they just sat in a comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the town settling down for the night. The silence between them was different now, no longer a space of distance and uncertainty, but one of shared understanding, forged in the fires of their recent struggle. Their relationship was like the new bell, taking its shape slowly, under pressure, growing stronger with each shared trial and quiet moment. One night, as a sliver of moon hung in the inky sky, Nora brought her journal with her. She sat beside him on the top step, the book open on her lap. "I called this The Days of Little Water," she said softly. I would like to read some of it to you." She read her spare, simple entries, her voice a low murmur in the darkness. She read of the broken cart, of the sandstorm, of the fear and the small acts of kindness. She read of his wound and of the chest he had built for her. When she finished, she closed the book, her heart feeling strangely exposed. He was silent for a long time, looking out at the town sleeping under the blanket of night. Then he turned his head and looked at her, his gray eyes soft in the moonlight. "They are not the days of little water anymore," he said. "Now, they are the days of enough." A week later, the mail rider brought a letter for Nora. It was from St. Louis, the envelope bearing the familiar, elegant script of her mother. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The family debt, the great weight that had pushed her west, had been the subject of her mother's worried correspondence for months. But this letter was different. She read that a fund had been started by the families of the children she had nursed and tutored back home. They had heard of her work in the West, and they had collected a sum of money, a gift of gratitude, and applied it to her family's account. The debt was not gone, but it was drastically reduced. No longer a crushing burden, but a manageable obligation. She was free. She folded the letter, a tear of gratitude tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She walked out of the church and stood on the steps of her small clinic. The sun was warm on her face, and there, in a crack between the stone steps, a place where nothing should have been able to grow, a small, tough cactus had taken root, and on its spiny flesh, a single, perfect flower, a delicate burst of waxy pink, had opened itself to the morning light. The rain came in late afternoon, a miracle that silenced the town. It was not a violent, wind-driven storm, but a soft, steady weeping from a sky the color of slate. For weeks, the sun had been a tyrant, baking the very memory of moisture from the earth. Now, the land drank. The people of Silver Butte stopped what they were doing and simply stood in doorways and under awnings, watching the water fall, their face tilted up to the heavens. The scent that rose from the thirsty ground was a thing of pure grace, a mix of dust and creosote and life, a perfume of answered prayers. Nora and Caleb were on the new church porch, having just finished securing a loose shutter, when the first heavy drops began to fall. They stood together under the shelter of the new roof, watching the street turn from pale dust to dark, rich mud. The sound of the rain on the wooden shingles was a gentle, rhythmic drumming, a peaceful counterpoint to the memory of fire and the clang of hammers. It was the sound of healing. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, the kind of silence they had built together, plank by plank, moment by moment. It was a silence that did not need to be filled. Finally, Caleb stirred. He reached into the pocket of his denim jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. "I made something for you," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the sound of the rain. He opened his hand. Lying in his calloused palm was a small object that seemed to capture the cool, gray light of the afternoon. It was a pendant, fashioned from a piece of metal that had been hammered and polished until it shone like old silver. It was shaped into a perfect, stylized drop of water. It was simple, elegant, and heavy with a meaning that went far beyond its form. Nora knew instantly what it was made from. It was a piece of the old bell, a shard of their shared tragedy, reforged into a symbol of their salvation. She reached out, her fingers hesitating for a moment before she touched it. The metal was cool and smooth. She picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, solid and real. She turned it over in her palm, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm that matched the falling rain. He had attached it to a thin, braided leather cord. He took it from her gently and moved to stand behind her. She felt the warmth of him at her back, a solid, reassuring presence. He lifted the cord and settled it around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin for a fleeting, electric moment. The pendant came to rest in the hollow of her throat, its coolness a startling contrast to the warmth of her skin. He moved back to stand in front of her, his gray eyes watching her face, searching for a reaction. "It is not to be bent by thirst," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "It is strong." His words held a double meaning, and she knew it. He was not just talking about the metal. He was talking about them, about what they had built, not out of desperation, but out of a shared, steady resolve. She looked down at the silver drop, then back up at his face. The rain was a curtain around them, enclosing them in a world of their own. This was a turning point, a moment that demanded a truth as clean and as clear as the water falling from the sky. Her own resolve hardened. She would not let this moment be built on an assumption, on a silence that could be misunderstood. She had to give him a truth of her own, a truth that was both a boundary and an invitation. Her hands were trembling, but she clasped them in front of her. She met his gaze, her own eyes unwavering. "Still a virgin, cowboy," she said. The words came out in a near whisper, but they were as stark and as honest as a line drawn in the dirt. She did not soften them, did not blush or look away. It was a warning. It was a fact. It was the most vulnerable part of herself, offered up like a fragile gift. For a long moment, Caleb did not react. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, but it was not shock or disappointment. It was a deep, quiet thoughtfulness. A slow smile touched the corners of his mouth, a smile of such genuine warmth and understanding that it uncoiled a knot of fear in her chest she had not even known was there. "Then I will be your patient forever," he replied, his voice soft, a vow spoken in the heart of the storm. The words washed over her, a wave of profound relief. He had understood. He had not just heard her, he had understood the meaning behind the words. He had seen her boundary not as a wall, but as a map. He had accepted her terms, and in doing so, had offered her a gift far greater than the silver pendant. He had given her safety. He had given her time. They stood there, the unspoken agreement settling between them like a warm blanket. Their love, if it was to be love, would not be a thing of haste or demand. It would grow at its own pace, a pace she would set. It would be built on the foundation they had already laid: shared labor, mutual respect, and a trust that had been tested by fire and flood. In that moment, the intimacy between them was more real and more profound than any touch could have been. It was the intimacy of two souls seeing each other with perfect clarity. Later, as the rain softened to a fine mist, they sat on the steps, the world washed clean and new. A splinter from the new wood of the porch railing had snagged her hand, leaving a thin, shallow scratch. Without a word, he took her hand, his touch infinitely gentle. He fetched a small tin of salve from his saddlebag and carefully, methodically, cleaned and dressed the tiny wound, his large hands moving with a practiced, soothing competence. It was an echo of the first time she had tended to him, the roles now reversed. She watched his dark head bent over her hand, and a wave of tenderness washed over her. When he was done, she did not pull her hand away. Instead, she turned it over and gently placed her palm over the jagged white scar that circled his wrist. "Do you still have the nightmares?" she asked softly. He did not pretend to misunderstand. He looked up, his eyes clouded with a distant memory. "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice barely audible above the dripping of the eaves. "The sound. It is the sound that stays." She did not offer empty platitudes. She simply held his hand, her thumb tracing the edge of the scar, a silent acknowledgement of the wound he carried, the one that no salve could heal. A playful light returned to her eyes a little while later. She looked at him, then at the steps, and a small smile played on her lips. "You are so slow. Grass will grow through these steps. Caleb Hart," she teased, her voice light. He looked at her, the corner of his own mouth twitching. "Grass needs water and time," he replied, his voice a low, gentle drawl. "So do we." As the last of the light faded and the mist began to glow with the rising of the moon, he leaned toward her. It was a slow, deliberate movement, giving her all the time in the world to turn away. She did not. She met him halfway. The kiss was brief, a soft, hesitant meeting of lips. It was chaste, tentative, and deeply respectful. It was not a spark intended to start a fire, but a quiet seal on a sacred promise. It did not cross the line she had drawn. It honored it. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers for a moment, his breath warm in the cool, damp air. She closed her eyes, memorizing the feeling of safety, of being completely and utterly cherished. That night, back in her room, she took out her journal. The lamplight cast a warm glow on the page. She uncapped her ink bottle and dipped her pen. Below her last entry, she wrote a new line, the words flowing from a heart that was full to bursting. A promise that knows how to wait. The piece in Silver Butte was like a new seedling, fragile and vulnerable. It did not take long for Royce Maddox to find a new way to poison the soil. He sent for his lawyer, a man named Fletcher from Prescott, who arrived in a cloud of dust and professional condescension. Fletcher was a man made of paper and ink, his weapon a leather briefcase full of convoluted clauses and legal precedents that had no place in the honest light of the desert sun. He did not threaten or bluster. He simply presented a new claim to the Water Council, the fissure in the rock. The small spring uncovered by the sandstorm, he argued, was not surface water. It was subterranean, and therefore it fell under the purview of Maddox's original mineral rights claim on the land. He produced a thick document, a copy of a territorial survey from years before, and pointed to a line of text so small it was nearly illegible. It was a legal maneuver designed to choke their new hope in a tangle of esoteric law. The council members, honest ranchers and merchants, were baffled and intimidated. The flow of water in their flume, which had seemed so pure and simple, was suddenly mired in the mud of legal interpretation. At the same time, a new and more personal threat arrived in town. He was a bounty hunter, a man who called himself Jedediah Kane. He was tall and lean, with a cruel, thin-lipped smile and the cold, empty eyes of a man who saw the world only in terms of profit and loss. He rode into town, dismounted in front of the saloon, and nailed a piece of paper to the door. It was a warrant for the arrest of Caleb Hart for the murder of Jonah Pike in Abilene. It offered a substantial reward. The document looked official. It bore a seal that looked authentic, and the signature of a Kansas judge. But Caleb and the town knew the truth. Judge Croft's official record, containing the sworn testimony of Elias Thorne, had cleared him completely. This warrant was a ghost, a lie resurrected to haunt him. The town, which had so recently embraced Caleb, was thrown into confusion. Old fears and suspicions were stirred up like dust. A lie on paper, signed and sealed, carried a terrible weight. The suspended sheriff, Alistair Pike, saw his opportunity. He emerged from the shadows he had been inhabiting since his disgrace. He was seen in quiet, intense conversation with Kane the bounty hunter and a handful of itinerant gamblers who had drifted into town. A new conspiracy was being woven. Its threads spun from vengeance and greed. The trap was sprung 3 nights later. Caleb was walking home from the forge when a commotion erupted from a back-alley gambling den. Pike appeared, no longer wearing a badge but still radiating a brutish authority. He dragged a gambler, his face theatrically bloodied, out into the street. He was cheating, the gambler cried, pointing a shaking finger at Caleb. I caught him. He had a card up his sleeve. When I called him on it, he attacked me and took my winnings. It was a clumsy, transparent lie. Caleb had not been anywhere near the gambling den, but Kane the bounty hunter was there in an instant, his pistol drawn. That is assault and robbery, Kane declared, his voice ringing with false authority. Add that to the murder warrant. You are coming with me. Hart. It was chaos. Pike was shouting, the gambler was moaning, and Kane was trying to put manacles on Caleb's wrists. But the people of Silver Butte were not the same people they had been a month ago. They had learned to question authority, especially when it smelled of Maddox and Pike. They formed a silent, human wall, blocking Kane's path. They did not draw weapons, they simply stood. Their presence a quiet, immovable objection. The standoff was broken by the arrival of Judge Croft's appointed deputy, a young, steady man who took one look at the scene and ordered everyone to stand down until morning, when the judge, who was due back in town, could sort it out. Nora had watched the entire scene unfold from the edge of the crowd, her heart a cold knot of fury. She knew this was a performance, a play staged for a single purpose to discredit and capture Caleb. The next morning, she did not wait for the judge. She went to the alleyway where the supposed fight had taken place. She was not alone. She brought her older students with her. "This," she told them, her voice calm and clear, "is a lesson in observation. A story was told here last night. We are going to find out if the story the dirt tells is the same one." The ground in the alley was a mess of scuffed earth and overturned debris. Nora pointed to the boot prints in the dust. "Every man leaves a signature with his feet," she explained. She took out a roll of oiled paper and a bag of charcoal dust. With infinite care, she showed the children how to lay the paper over a clear boot print and gently rub the charcoal over it, transferring the pattern of the sole and heel onto the paper. They worked for an hour, a strange and silent team of investigators. They documented every clear print they could find. Then they went to the livery stable. Kane's horse was there, and beside it, his boots, which he had left for the stable boy to clean. Working quickly, Nora made an impression of the bounty hunter's boot sole. They laid the charcoal rubbings out on the floor of the schoolroom. The story they told was undeniable. The deep, frantic scuff marks of the supposed fight were all made by two sets of boots, the gamblers and Pike's. Caleb's boot print was nowhere near the overturned table, but Kane's boot print, the signature of the bounty hunter, was there, pressed deep into the dirt, right where the gambler claimed to have fallen. A clear indication that he had been a participant in the staging, not a witness who arrived later. When Mr. Fletcher, Maddox's lawyer, arrived at the church to deliver another legal threat regarding the water rights, he found Nora waiting for him on the porch, the charcoal rubbings laid out like evidence in a trial. "What is this childish nonsense?" he asked with a sneer. "It is a story, Mr. Fletcher," Nora replied, her voice as cool and sharp as a shard of glass. "A story written in dirt and charcoal. It is a story about a lie." She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unflinching. "Here, words do not shoot bullets, but they can pierce a forged document, and the truth, even when it is written in dust, can hang a man who tries to sell a lie for gold." Fletcher looked at the damning evidence, then at Nora's resolute face, and for the first time, his professional composure faltered. He turned and left without another word. When Judge Croft arrived, Nora presented her findings. The judge examined the rubbings, listened to her clear, logical explanation, and his face grew hard as granite. He issued a new warrant, not for Caleb, but for the arrest of Jedediah Kane and Alistair Pike for conspiracy and for the apprehension of the forger who had created the fake warrant, Royce Maddox, for his clear involvement in this new scheme, had another charge added to his growing list: obstruction of justice. That night, the immediate threat to Caleb had passed, but the ordeal had taken its toll. Nora found him by the new flume, the sound of the flowing water a quiet whisper in the darkness. He was staring into the water, but his gaze was 1,000 miles away. The silence between them was different tonight, tinged with his weariness. She stood beside him, not touching him, just letting her presence be a comfort. "Finally," he spoke, his voice so low she had to lean in to hear it. "I am afraid," he confessed, the words torn from a place deep inside him. Not of them, not of their guns or their lies. In the quiet, when the work is done and the night is still, I am afraid I am not worthy of it. Of this, of you. The raw vulnerability of his confession cracked her heart open. She thought of the promise he had made to her, to be patient forever. She thought of his steadfastness, his quiet courage, his hands that could be so strong and so gentle. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "Caleb," she said softly, turning to face him. "Silence is when you can hear your own heart. It is the truest thing you have. And yours is beating true." In the midst of these personal struggles, the town continued to mature. The first elections for the Community Water Council were held. Samuel the blacksmith was elected chairman. Mary Winters was elected secretary. They held their first official meeting, and their first order of business was to ratify a covenant of shared use to ensure absolute fairness. Caleb forged a new tool, a long, flat ruler made of steel, marked with clear, incised lines. It was a community measuring stick. It was installed at the head of the flume, and a new town tradition was born. Each day, a different child from Nora's school was given the responsibility of being the keeper of the measure, ensuring that the water level was correct and that no one took more than their allotted share. The practice of secret fees and private deals died out completely. Even the families who had once sided with Maddox, seeing the clear, irrefutable fairness of the new system, began to participate. They brought their buckets to the well, paid their small, fair fee to the council, and took their water. It was a quiet revolution of the spirit, as one old rancher, a man who had been one of Maddox's staunchest supporters, admitted to Samuel at the forge, "Fair water just makes for better tea." The rhythm of the town had changed. The emotional center was no longer just the story of a man and a woman fighting for their place. It was the story of an entire community learning to stand together, to trust in rules of its own making, and to place its future in the hands of its children. Royce Maddox was a man being squeezed. The law, which had once been his most pliable tool, was now a vice, tightened by the steady hand of Judge Croft. His social standing had crumbled. His power over the town's water supply was gone, and his attempts to frame and intimidate his opposition had backfired spectacularly. A lesser man might have retreated, cut his losses, but Maddox's pride was a brittle, venomous thing. Backed into a corner, he did not seek escape. He chose to lash out, to bring the whole structure of Silver Butte's new hope crashing down. If he could not own the water, then no one would have it. The night he chose was in late August, a time when the air itself felt stretched thin and ready to snap. The heat of the day did not recede with the sunset, but lingered, thick and suffocating. A storm was brewing in the distant mountains, its presence felt in the oppressive stillness and the faint, metallic taste in the air. Nora was woken from a restless sleep not by a loud noise, but by a subtle, unsettling one. It was a sound that did not belong to the night's usual chorus of crickets and distant coyotes. It was the sound of wood groaning under a terrible strain, a low, tortured creak that seemed to travel through the very bones of the earth. She sat bolt upright in her bed, her heart suddenly pounding. She went to the window and listened. There it was again, a faint, prolonged groan from the direction of the foothills. The flume. She did not wait to dress fully. Pulling on her skirt and boots over her nightdress, she ran from her room, down the stairs, and across the street, her bare feet silent on the dusty ground. She did not go to the deputy's office. She went to the livery stable, where Caleb often slept in the loft. "Caleb!" she called up into the darkness, her voice a harsh whisper. "Caleb, wake up! Something is wrong at the flume." He was down the ladder in an instant, pulling on his boots, his movement swift and sure even in the groggy moments after sleep. He listened for a moment, his head cocked and his face hardened. He heard it too. He did not need to ask questions. He saddled his horse with an economy of motion born of 1,000 emergencies. As he worked, Nora ran to the blacksmith shop and then to the Winters homestead, her urgent knocking raising the first of the volunteers. By the time Caleb led his horse out into the street, a small, grim-faced group had gathered, armed with lanterns and a shared sense of dread. They moved as a silent, determined unit, their lanterns bobbing in the oppressive darkness as they made their way up the path toward the head of the water channel. The air grew heavier with each step, and the first drops of rain, fat and warm, began to fall. A low rumble of thunder echoed from the mountains. As they rounded the last bend in the trail, the source of the groaning sound became horribly clear. 2 of the main support beams of the flume had been sawn almost all the way through. The great wooden trough, heavy with the weight of the town's water, was sagging dangerously, its timbers creaking in protest. It was a scene of deliberate, malicious sabotage. And then, in a brilliant, terrifying flash of lightning that bleached the landscape white for a half-second, they saw them. 3 figures, their faces hidden by the brims of their hats, were huddled at the base of the main support pillar. One of them was holding a bundle of what looked like waxed paper sticks. Another was kneeling, a small flame sputtering in his hands as he touched it to a long, snaking fuse. There was no time to think. Caleb let out a guttural yell and launched himself forward. The saboteurs, startled, looked up. The man with the fuse dropped it and scrambled back, drawing a pistol. But Caleb was not running toward them. He was running toward the dynamite. He reached the sputtering fuse just as the first shot rang out, whistling past his ear. He ignored it. He grabbed the bundle of dynamite, its paper wrapping slick in the now steady rain. He had a split second to make a decision that would determine the fate of the town. He could throw it into the open, where the blast would surely bring down the entire hillside, or he could throw it at the men, an act of violence that was not in his nature. He did something else. His eyes scanned the darkness and found what he was looking for, a deep, sandy pit a dozen yards away, where the recent rains had collected into a pool of muddy water. With a desperate heave, he threw the bundle, a dark arc against the stormy sky. It landed with a soft splash in the wet sand. He threw himself to the ground, covering his head with his arms, just as the world erupted in a cataclysm of light and sound. The wet sand did its job, muffling the worst of the blast, turning what would have been a deafening, destructive explosion into a contained, percussive thud that shook the very ground. But it was not enough to contain all of it. Caleb felt a white, hot, searing pain in the side of his head, followed by a profound and terrifying silence. A silence that was not the absence of sound, but the death of it. Nora was already running toward him before the echo of the blast had faded. The other volunteers, recovering from the shock, had given chase to the saboteurs, who were now fleeing into the darkness. Nora had only one focus. She knelt beside Caleb in the pouring rain, her hands searching for the injury. The side of his head was bleeding, a dark stain spreading from his right ear. He was conscious, his eyes wide with shock, but he was not responding to her voice. She ripped a strip of cloth from her petticoat, her movements deft and sure. This was her battlefield. The rain was relentless, washing the blood away almost as fast as it flowed. In the flickering, chaotic light of the lanterns, she saw the damage. The concussive force of the blast had done its work. She gently touched the area behind his ear, and her fingers told her what she feared. She had to relieve the pressure, and she had to do it now. She opened her medical bag, her hands miraculously steady. She took out a small, gleaming scalpel. "Hold the lantern closer," she commanded Mary Winters, who was now kneeling beside her. Mary did as she was told, her face a pale mask of fear, but her hands did not tremble. Nora took a deep breath. She whispered his name, though she knew he could not hear her. Then, with the precise, practiced touch of a healer, she made a small, clean incision in the skin behind his ear. She worked quickly, her knowledge guiding her in the near impossible conditions. She applied a thick pressure bandage, wrapping it tightly around his head. "Stay with me, Caleb," she said, her voice loud and clear, hoping the vibration might reach him. "Stay with me." She needed to keep him from sliding into unconsciousness. She needed to anchor him to the world. And so, she began to talk. She began to recite the only scripture she knew that held the power to save him. She told him the story of their town. The days of little water are over. "Caleb," she said, her voice a rhythmic chant against the drumming of the rain. "Today, Samuel forged new brackets for the flume. Today, Mrs. Winters brought us cornmeal. Today, you taught the children how to make a splint. She was reciting her journal, their shared history, a litany of hope spoken into the heart of a storm. She was still chanting when the riders appeared, their horses materializing out of the rain-swept darkness. It was Judge Croft and his men. The judge had been on his way back to Silver Butte for the formal hearing when he had heard the distant, muffled boom. He had seen the lanterns on the hillside. He had known, with a grim certainty, that Maddox had made his final, desperate play. He had already sent 2 of his men to block the main trails out of the valley. They found Royce Maddox in his study, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on his desk. He feigned surprise, but a search of his office produced a crudely drawn map of the flume, with the main support pillar circled in red. In the barn, they found the men who had lit the fuse, their boots still caked in the mud of the foothills. The net had been drawn, and the predators were caught. Back at the flume, the immediate danger to Caleb had passed, but the danger to the town's water supply remained. The damaged support beams were groaning, threatening to give way at any moment. Samuel the blacksmith took charge. "We need to brace it. Now!" he yelled over the storm. What followed was a testament to the town's new spirit. A human chain formed, stretching from the stand of timber on the lower slope all the way up to the sagging flume. Men and women stood shoulder to shoulder in the mud and the rain, passing heavy beams of wood from one to another. It was a slow, agonizing process, but the chain did not break. They worked through the night, their movements illuminated by the lightning that still tore at the sky. They were a living artery, their collective strength flowing up the hillside to save the lifeline of their community. The trial of Royce Maddox was held the next day in the town square. The sky was washed clean, and the sun shone with a fierce, impartial light. The entire town was present. The evidence was overwhelming, but Judge Croft allowed for one final piece of testimony. He called for the keeper of the measure for that day, a small girl of 8 named Sarah Winters. Trembling, she came forward, carrying the steel measuring stick Caleb had forged. The judge asked her to explain its purpose. "This is so it is fair," she said, her small voice carrying in the silence. "The red line is for the morning. The blue line is for the afternoon. Everyone gets the same. It is the rule." She held up the ruler. It was not just a piece of steel. It was a covenant. It was a symbol of the order and fairness that Maddox had tried to destroy. Then Nora was called. She did not bring her journal. She simply stood before the judge, her hand resting on the silver drop of water at her throat. "This pendant," she said, her voice ringing with a quiet, powerful clarity, "was made from our old bell, a bell that was broken in a fire set by malice. It was reforged, just as we have been reforged. It represents a community that will not be bent by thirst or by fear." The verdict was a formality. Royce Maddox was found guilty of extortion, conspiracy, forgery, and the willful destruction of public property. His lands, including the Blue Well, were declared forfeit to the territory, to be held in trust for the town of Silver Butte. He was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor. Alistair Pike faced his own trial for his role in the conspiracies, and a warrant was issued for the bounty hunter, Kane, who was now a fugitive from the very law he had pretended to represent. Justice, slow but relentless, had finally come to Silver Butte. In the days that followed, the town began to heal. The flume was repaired, stronger than before, but Caleb's healing was a slower, more complicated process. The wound on his head healed, but the wound inside did not. The world, for him, was no longer a place of quiet. It was filled with a constant, high-pitched ringing, the ghost of the explosion that had taken his hearing in one ear. The sound was a constant torment, a reminder of the violence and chaos. One evening, Nora found him standing by the flume, his face tight with pain, his hands pressed to the side of his head. She stood in front of him and took his hands in hers. "Listen to the water, Caleb," she said softly, Just listen to the water. She led him through a simple breathing exercise, a technique she had learned for calming patients in distress. Breathe in with the sound of the flow, she instructed, and breathe out the sound of the ringing. They stood there for a long time, the sun setting behind them. He closed his eyes and did as she said. He breathed in the steady, life-giving murmur of the water moving through the channel. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, the sound of the water began to grow louder in his mind, while the ghost of the explosion, the terrible, incessant ringing, began to recede. It was not gone, but for the first time since that night, it was no longer the only thing he could hear. The seasons turned, and Silver Butte entered a period of quiet, deliberate creation. The scorched earth of the church porch was cleared, and a new foundation of native limestone, solid and enduring, was laid. The townspeople, working together, raised new walls for a structure that was now more than just a church. It was a town hall, a school, and a clinic. Its purpose broadened by the trials it had endured. The new building was a testament to their resilience, built not of flimsy wood that could be easily burned, but of the very rock of the valley itself. Over the main doorway, a new sign was hung, painted by Nora in clean, clear letters. It no longer separated her functions, but united them under a single philosophy: water words, wellness, for all who thirst. The day the new bell was raised was a town holiday. It had been cast at the forge by Samuel and Caleb, a long and arduous process of melting down the broken shards of the old bell and adding scrap iron donated by every household. It was smaller than the original, its tone a little higher, a little clearer, as if it had shed the sorrows of the past. As it was hoisted into the new belfry, a hush fell over the crowd. When Caleb pulled the rope for the first time, the clear, bright peal that rang out was more than just a sound. It seemed to travel down the hill and merge with the soft, constant murmur of the water flowing in the flume. It was the sound of the town's two hearts, its spiritual and its physical, beating in unison. Caleb's work did not end with the bell. He took the steel measuring stick, the one that had been presented as evidence at the trial, and he spent an entire day at the forge, not with fire, but with a set of fine engraving tools. With the same painstaking care he had used to write his first letter, he etched a phrase into the metal. Just below the painted lines, the children used to measure the water level. The letters were simple and strong, a permanent declaration of the principle they had fought for. It read, "Justice flows." The measuring stick was no longer just a tool. It was a memorial. During this time of renewal, Nora's own burdens continued to lighten. Another letter arrived from her mother in St. Louis. It contained no grand news, only the steady report of a debt shrinking, paid down by Nora's own small contributions, and the continued, astonishing generosity of the communities she had left behind. Tucked into the folds of the letter was a small, paper-wrapped object. Nora opened it carefully. Inside was a lock of silvery gray hair, tied with a piece of blue thread. A note in her mother's hand read simply, "A mother's thanks for a daughter's strength." Nora held the lock of hair in her palm, a tangible piece of the home she had fought so hard to save from afar. The weight on her shoulders, which had once felt like a mountain, was now no more than a stone in her pocket, a reminder not of obligation, but of a love that spanned a continent. The most profound evidence of the town's transformation could be seen in its children. The listlessness that had once clouded their eyes was gone, replaced by a bright, energetic curiosity. Their cheeks were fuller, their laughter louder. They were the first generation of Silver Butte to grow up with the certainty of clean water and the promise of an education. One afternoon, Sarah Winters, the little girl who had testified at the trial, stood on the church porch to practice her reading. She chose the new town charter, the one that the Water Council had drafted and posted for all to see. She read the final line, her small voice ringing out with perfect, unwavering clarity. "In Silver Butte, all who thirst may drink." It was a statement of fact, a promise, and a prayer, all in one. Nora and Caleb moved in their own orbit. their relationship developing with the slow, unhurried pace of a desert bloom. The promise made in the rain, to be patient forever, was not a restraint but a liberation. It gave them the freedom to build their connection on a foundation deeper than passion, on the bedrock of shared experience and absolute trust. There was an unspoken understanding between them. They were a partnership, a unit. The formal declaration of that union, the words before a judge, the signing of a paper, would happen when the time was right. It would happen when Nora felt the last of the world's uncertainties fall away, when she felt truly and completely secure. When that day came, they would not have a grand wedding. They would ride to Prescott, register their intent at the courthouse, and return to celebrate with the town that had become their family, sharing cornbread and mint tea under the wide, benevolent sky. One evening, Nora returned to her clinic to find a folded piece of paper on her desk. It was a single sheet of foolscap, the kind used for legal documents, but this was something far more important. She recognized the handwriting immediately, though she had never seen more than his signature. It was from Caleb. She unfolded it, her heart catching in her throat. It was the first real letter he had ever written in his life. It was only 7 lines long. The letters were large and slanted, formed with the intense concentration of a man for whom words on a page were a new and difficult language. The spelling was not perfect, and the ink was smudged in one corner, as if he had hesitated, his hand resting on the page. But the message itself was as clear and as true as the tone of the new bell. It read, "Nora, I do not have many words. My hands are better with iron and wood. But I know this. Before you came, I had a place to sleep. Now I know what it is to be home. You are home." Nora read the 7 simple lines, and the tears that came were not tears of sorrow or of struggle, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful. She held the clumsy, beautiful letter to her chest, the paper a more precious treasure than any jewel. Judge Croft's work in Silver Butte was finally done. Before he left, he held one last meeting with the new Water Council. He presented them with the official, territorial charter for the Silver Butte Public Water Trust, its language now formalized, its authority absolute. It was bound in a simple leather folder and embossed with the seal of the territorial court. "Keep this safe," he told them. "It is the foundation of your future. A community is not built on rock or wood. It is built on the strength of its agreements." The council members, led by Samuel, accepted the document with a solemn reverence. They decided unanimously where it should be kept. It was not locked away in a safe in the deputy's office. It was placed in the new wooden chest in Nora's schoolroom, alongside the primers and the histories, a lesson for the children on the power of a just and binding promise. That night, Nora and Caleb sat on the porch steps, the air cool and alive with the scent of sage. The sky was a deep, bottomless velvet, studded with 1,000,000 brilliant stars. They had been sitting in comfortable silence for some time, watching the constellations wheel overhead. Nora, her voice soft in the stillness, asked a question that had been resting on her heart. "What if, someday, I wanted a family?" Caleb did not answer right away. He looked up at the vast, star-filled sky, as if searching for the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was slow, thoughtful, and full of a quiet certainty that filled her with a profound peace. "I will learn to hold a child," he said, "like I learned to hold timber. Slow and steady. I will learn." They fell silent again, but the silence was different now. It was filled with the shape of a possible future, a future of slow and steady learning, of building a life together, piece by piece. They sat there for a long time, listening to the gentle, rhythmic sigh of the pump handle at the blue well, a sound that was no longer a reminder of thirst, but a lullaby of peace. The journey to Prescott was not a grand procession. It was just 2 people on a wagon, a quiet man and a resolute woman. Traveling through the country they had fought to make their own. The ceremony was held in the spare, sunlit office of a justice of the peace, a man with kind eyes who seemed to understand that the truest vows are not the loudest. Nora wore a simple dress of gray cotton, the one she saved for Sundays. Caleb wore a clean blue shirt, his dark hair still damp from a thorough washing. Their only witnesses were Samuel the blacksmith, his large, calloused hand looking out of place as he signed the official ledger, and a handful of the older children who had insisted on making the trip, their faces scrubbed and solemn. When Nora and Caleb emerged from the courthouse, husband and wife in the eyes of the law, the children did not throw rice or flowers. Instead, they opened a small burlap sack and tossed handfuls of dried cactus petals into the air. The delicate, papery flakes of pink and yellow drifted down around them, a confetti born of the harsh, beautiful landscape they called home. It was a perfect, fitting celebration. They returned to Silver Butte not to a feast, but to the life they had already built. The promise Caleb had made in the rain, to be her patient forever, was not a prelude to a different kind of life. It was the blueprint for the one they were already living. It was woven into the fabric of their days, in the respectful space he gave her, in the quiet trust she gave him. It was in the way he would watch her teach, his presence a silent, steady support. It was in the way she would sit with him at the forge, reading aloud as he worked, her voice a soothing counterpoint to the ring of the hammer. Their love was a slow, deep river, its course set not by a sudden flood of passion, but by the patient carving of a shared path through a stubborn landscape. It was, as he had said, a thing of water and of time. A month after their return, Caleb began a new project at the forge. He took the largest remaining piece of the shattered bell, a fragment too warped to be melted into the new one, and began to work it. For days. The town heard the familiar sounds of the forge, but this was a different kind of work, slower, more meticulous. He was not making a tool, he was making a statement. When he was finished, he carried the object, wrapped in a heavy cloth, to the blue well. It was a small sculpture, a solid, heavy drop of water, its surface hammered and polished until it held the reflection of the sky. It was a larger, more permanent version of the pendant he had made for Nora. Samuel helped him mount it on a stone base beside the pump handle, before they cemented it in place. Nora came with a set of small, sharp chisels, with the same focused intensity she brought to her medical work. She carefully carved an inscription into the stone. She did not carve their names. She carved the principle that had become the town's creed: water belongs to the community. The sculpture was not a monument to their victory, but a permanent reminder of their shared responsibility. The town's reputation, like the water in the flume, had begun to flow beyond the confines of the valley. One afternoon, a long, slow-moving caravan of canvas-topped wagons rumbled into town. They were migrants, a whole community of families heading west, their face etched with the weariness of the trail. Their leader, a stern-faced man with a patriarchal beard, approached Nora at the clinic, his manner wary. "We have heard a strange tale," he said, his voice skeptical, "that there is a town in this valley with fair water. Is this true?" Nora smiled. "It is," she said. "Come, let me show you." She did not take him to the well. She led him, and a small delegation from his party, up the path to the flume. She showed them the steel measuring stick, its engraved words gleaming in the sun. She introduced him to that day's keeper of the measure, a young boy who explained the red and blue lines with a grave and practiced authority. She took them to the schoolroom and showed them the town charter, kept in the chest with the children's books. The man listened, his stern face slowly softening into an expression of profound astonishment. He had seen the law of the gun and the law of the dollar on the frontier. He had never seen the law of the measuring stick, enforced by a child. His people stayed in Silver Butte for a week, resting their livestock and replenishing their supplies. They paid the fair price for their water, and their presence was not a burden, but a boon, a welcome infusion of commerce and new stories. On their last night, the town held a gathering in the new church hall, It was not a formal party, but a night of storytelling, one by one. The people of Silver Butte got up and told their own small part of the story. Mary Winters spoke of the day Nora had looked at her ledger, not with pity, but with a fire in her eyes. Samuel the blacksmith spoke of the night Caleb had stood at the forge, hammering their broken bell into a new shape. Even Sarah Winters, the little girl, stood up and shyly recounted the day she had shown the measuring stick to the judge. The theme of the night was not the great battle, but the small moments of courage, the quiet decisions to stand together. It was a celebration of the day of enough water, a day that, they now understood, had been made not by one hero, but by the combined will of a whole community. Later that night, as the last of the migrants' campfires dwindled to embers, Nora and Caleb sat on their porch, the sounds of the town at peace washed over them. A gentle tide of chirping crickets and the distant, lonely call of an owl.
"The sound of the explosion,"
Caleb said, his voice a low murmur in the darkness.
"The ringing in my head, it has grown smaller."
Nora turned to look at him, her heart full. She waited. "I think," he continued, his gaze fixed on the dark line of the hills, "it is because the sound of the water has grown louder." She took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. The water was not just in the well or in the flume. It was in the steady, peaceful rhythm of their new life. It was a current of healing, washing away the echoes of old traumas, making space for a quiet future. The moon rose, a perfect silver disk in the clear desert sky. Its light fell upon the steel measuring stick at the head of the flume, illuminating the engraved words. The water in the channel was high and steady, its surface a mirror for the calm, orderly heavens. The life they had built in Silver Butte was not a grand or glorious thing. It was not a life of wealth or of ease, but it was sufficient. It was clean, and it was fair. They had learned that justice on the frontier was not something that came from the barrel of a gun. It was a slow, patient thing, built from shared rules and a willingness to listen, to wait, to trust. The coming dry season held no fear for them. The Water Council had already made plans. They would build a small, temporary watering station on the main cattle trail. A gesture of goodwill to the drovers who passed through. The children of Silver Butte, the keepers of the measure, would take turns managing it. Their payment a stick of mint candy and the pride of a job well done. It was a promise to the future, a system designed to last. From the belfry, the new bell rang out. A single, clear note marking the late hour. The sound hung in the cool, clean air, a final, peaceful benediction on the sleeping town. Nora squeezed Caleb's hand. He turned to her, his gray eyes soft in the moonlight, and he whispered the words that had become the foundation of their world, the truest vow he could ever make. Patient forever. She smiled, a slow, radiant smile that held all the love and peace her heart could contain. She leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered the final, perfect word that completed their story. Thank you for being part of our story tonight. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And remember to subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help more people discover our tales.